another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Today I'm talking to Forrest Mozer, and originally you are a physicist, right?
Not recently. It's about 60 years I've been a physicist. I'm a professor of physics at Berkeley, at the University of California.
Great. But today we are talking about your pioneering your invention of a speech synthesis and speech recognition.
Yes.
So how did it happen that you invented that, which is a totally different field than what I read? You are usually doing plasma fields research.
Well, I'll explain. As I said, I'm a physicist. I work a lot in the lab building instruments that fly in satellites. And this whole speech business started really as a matter of curiosity. I wondered, what is it about, how do I generate speech, and what properties of speech is it that you use to understand what I say? And so one day in the lab, I just set up an oscilloscope and started talking into it and looking at waveforms, and that evolved. I can tell you a little of the evolution if you want to hear that. Okay. As far back as I can remember, the very first thing I did that was beyond just looking at waveforms in oscilloscopes was I went out to Radio Shack, which is a local electronics company, and bought all the switches that they had. And I set these up in a long string on a piece of wood and built the electronics such that these were ones and zeros, depending on how I flipped my switches. And then I ran a signal through them so that this long string of, 50 or 60 switches produced a time domain waveform of ones and zeros. And I tried to make that time domain waveform of ones and zeros have the same spectrum as some speech. So I would say, and then I would do a Fourier analysis of it, and then I would set the switches to 1 and 0, and then I'd go around playing it, and people, I would say, what does that sound like? And people would say a machine. Because, you play for a while, it just sounds like a machine. And so I got a little more sophisticated than that, and started doing some computer analyses. And again, this was all just curiosity at this point. But I noticed that there's an awful lot of redundancy in speech. So if you look at a speech waveform, one speech period looks very much like the next speech period. And it started to occur to me that I could really compress speech by some large factor. I didn't know the factor when that occurred to me, but I thought, gee, I'll try to see how much I can compress speech. And again, this was intellectual curiosity. I wasn't financially or motivated because I hadn't realized it. But as I started compressing the speech and more, I started realizing that I can get a compression factor of about a factor of 100 in speech. And those were the days when storing a second of speech as a digital waveform filled up a fairly expensive memory. And speech wasn't therefore a good idea in products because of the huge data storage requirement. But I realized that if I could compress speech by, say, a factor of 100, then instead of putting a second of speech into a memory, I could maybe put 50 or 100 seconds, and that became commercially viable. So I worked towards that goal, ended up being able to get a compression factor of the order of 50 or 100, filed a patent application. And the importance of that technology at the time was that the nature of the compression was such that you could reconstruct the speech from the compressed data without need for use of very much computer power. So, there were the conventional speech compression and synthesis techniques that existed at that time, but the reconstruction and those involved things like Fourier transforms and storing Fourier components and things like that. But the reconstruction of speech from that kind of data required more computing problem than could go into a toy or a game. So my invention turned out to be practical for a period of time because I could get the same compression as everybody else, but you didn't need very much computing power to reconstruct the speech. So there was a period of time then when my technology was the leader, but what has happened with time, of course, is that computers, microprocessors got better, memories got bigger, and I really don't know an awful lot about speech technology, so that the nature of the technology surpassed my knowledge, and other people or other companies like Texas Instruments, for example, started building speech synthesizers that were competitive with mine and in fact sounded better. So there was a period of time when my speech technology was economically important, but that time is long past.
So you found out about the possibility by accident. You didn't plan to actually pioneer
it's
in
not.
something
I didn't
like
go into it saying, "Let's see, can I get rich here?" or something like that. I went into it because it was a matter of curiosity. I should also say that towards the middle or end of this invention period, I had a graduate student who was blind. His name was Kent Cullers, and he is as far as I understand it, the first blind PhD physicist who ever got a PhD in the United States. And he came to work for me, and so a popular version that I've heard of this story is that provided me the impetus to go out and discover something. But that's not true. The ordering was the opposite. But Kent was a very helpful guy, and because he listened to my speech, and he had contacts with a company called Telesensory Systems that made aids to the handicapped, and he used some of their equipment. So the first thing I did when I thought I had a commercially viable technology was go down there and license them, and they produced what I believe to be the world's first talking electronic product, which was a calculator for the blind.
You mentioned in other interviews that actually I read it, I don't know if it's true, that in many occasions the voice was used, the technique was used, your voice was used for the
Certainly,
speech.
I was the cheapest labor I knew. So,
okay.
Initially, the very first commercial products that I did were monotones, because I hadn't yet figured out how to make a variable speech with the compressed data that I had. And so those all use my voice. So the talking calculator was my voice, but you can't really tell it's my voice. It sounds like a robot. It sounds it's a monotone. By the way, I have that calculator here if you'd like to see it.
Sure.
Let me get it out here. Hang on. So can you see this is the
perfect.
World's first talking calculator, and I'll turn it on, turn the volume up, and see if you can hear it. So I'm going to do
6 plus 5 times 9 equals 99.00.
So there you have an example. Were you able to hear that?
Perfect.
Okay, so it's also a perfect monotone, as you may have noticed. All right, I'll set him aside.
I mean, back in the day, it was probably amazing. You wouldn't expect a machine to talk, actually.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was amazed by it also. Certainly that wasn't what I started out planning to do. But that was a good product for the handicapped, and it was very popular in that community. The company that I licensed for this for using my technology in this calculator. As I say, I think their name was Telesensory Systems or something. They were also selling they designed a simple LSI chip, and they were also selling that to other people. And my memory is not clear. I after my exclusivity with Telesensory ended, I licensed National Semiconductor, and they also designed a talking chip that they called the Digitalker. And I think it was the Digitalker that was, and not the Telesensory chip that was sold, for example, to Commodore 64. But I can't remember that for sure.
I remember you said once that the product you enjoyed the most working for was Ghostbusters on the Commodore 64.
Yes, certainly. And I've noticed that, now there's a new Ghostbusters out with an all-woman cast. And I don't know if it's gotten to Europe yet.
Of course, yes.
It's on my list. I have to go see it, not because I thought the movie was so great, but for old time's sake. I've just got to go see Ghostbusters. And he slimed me.
Yes.
Yeah, I said that. He slimed me.
So later on you found out how to make it less monotone, because I remember Ghostbusters playing as a kid. It wasn't monotone. You would scream, Ghostbusters,
Yeah. No, it was, if I hadn't really thought of it initially, but after I sat down and thought a little, it was clear how to make it be a non-monotone and still stay within the parameters that the reconstruction algorithm had to be simple. So then I made it non-monotone.
I remember I was interviewing David Crane, who coded Ghostbusters, and he said Ghostbusters himself wasn't so exciting for him. You did all the digitizing work. He let you do the hard work for getting the speech and so on done.
Yeah. I should comment that with that technology, the reconstruction, as I've said, the reconstruction algorithm is easy. It's nothing more than adding numbers and looking up data in a memory. The hard part of that technology was compressing the data. So that took a person, and it took, I'm just trying to remember, but a lot of minutes per word. I don't think it took an hour per word, but something close to that. So you want to digitize, you want to have 100-word vocabulary, that you're going to spend 50 or 75 hours compressing the data.
Was that because the computers were so slow?
No, it's that you had to do a lot of listening because the parameters of the algorithm are variable. So, depending on the speech, some of the parameters could be used more for compression than other parameters. So it was a lot of trial and error. You try something, listen to it, and try something else and listen to it, and try to optimize the quality in that way.
So it wasn't like you knew when you did it how it would sound afterwards?
No, what if I understand your question, each word or each short phrase, you'd spend hours on a phrase trying to get it to sound right. And
exactly.
one of the problems of doing this is that no matter how bad it sounds, after you listen to it for a while, it starts to sound pretty good. So it really took more than one person to compress it. So one person could do his best and then give it to another person who did his best.
You get used to it.
You get used to it, yeah. So it's like listening to a bad accent. If you listen to a bad accent for a while, it starts to sound pretty good. And that's what happened when we were doing the compression. So I had 2 or 3 friends or colleagues who worked with me. And so I would do a little bit of it, and then they'd do a little bit of it, and then I'd do a little bit of it, and eventually it would sound not great, but intelligible is the better word. Not good, but intelligible.
And asking other composers for video game music, for example, Jeroen Tel from the Netherlands, he told me when he did for Turbo Outrun the digital samples, and he was counting at the beginning, 1, 2, 3. He actually had to say 1, 2, 3 because 3 would sound like free. So you
That's
actually
right.
had to say it wrong
You
to
have to
make it sound
emphasize.
correctly.
That's certainly correct, and you learn that the fricatives, which are the S as in Sam, and the F as in Forest, and TH as in 3. Those things you have to do special emphasis on to make them come out, and that was another thing we learned by trial and error.
Wow. That must have made the process pretty expensive. I mean,
Well,
it
the
probably
front,
was a lot of
yeah.
costs adding to the game, to the product.
Well, the front end was expensive, so that the fee to make a vocabulary was rather expensive, but the implementation in a product was really quite cheap because it could be done with a really simple microprocessor. It didn't really require an awful lot of computing power and an awful lot of memory. So the expensive part was, in the beginning, getting the vocabulary, and then the cheaper part was putting it into an awful lot of Commodore 64s and many other different products.
And what was your thought that your technique was used in video games? I mean, people can see the use of using it in calculators for handicapped people, for blind people. But back in the 80s and 90s especially, people were thinking that video games are a time waster, a waste of time and not really worth such a lot of investment, so much effort.
Well, but the marketplace didn't view it that way. These first products with speech, the first video games, the 25-cent video games like that Atari did, for example, those were remarkably popular at that time. And I wasted a huge amount of time because every time a new product came out, I would have to go down to the video game store and listen to it and see what people said about it. So it took a lot of my time, but that was the beginning of what's become a huge marketplace.
So you were very open-minded, even back then. You weren't like saying, this is a waste of time. You were even interested in hearing what people think.
Yeah, it was fun. As I say, it started off just as an intellectual challenge, but ended up being, I get a big kick out of the idea that the first talking product was mine. And I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, in Washington D.C., and the first talking elevator in the world used my technology and was in the Department of, I think, Health and Human Services in Washington. So it used to be that every time I'd go to Washington, I'd have to go to the Department of Health and Human Services and ride up and down in the elevator. I just got a tremendous kick out of that, and it was financially highly beneficial also, of course. But I wasn't motivated, and at least initially, was not at all motivated by financial, by making myself rich.
Okay, so that means because you had the technology and it was used in video games, did it even make you interested in video games? Were you interested about the game itself?
No, I don't understand why people like to sit there for hours and hours and shoot each other. No, so I in a way, our humanity would be better off if there weren't shoot 'em up games. But so that part didn't interest me at all. But the idea that people would, I like to see people turn it on and hear the voice and be surprised. That was a great, great satisfaction for my ego.
So that means, from your point of view, the latest development, like Let's Plays, where you see other people playing, that would be even more weird to you, I guess.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Uninteresting is a good description. Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting in watching other people playing rather than playing it yourself?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And using my technology, of course. There's a tremendous personal kick that one gets out of seeing something that you did in use. and its use in video games was probably the most popular use, uh, which that was okay. I would rather it be used in other ways, but that was also very satisfying. When I licensed National Semiconductor, they had a division that made checkout terminals for grocery stores and things like that. And they put the speech into the checkout terminals, thinking it's a great idea that each product that the cashier rings up would tell you the amount. So you could sit there and watch the cost of each item that you were buying. And at that time, we thought that would be a huge hit. Turns out it wasn't. People didn't really care about the cost of each item. And so I drove on several occasions down to grocery stores in San Jose where this technology was put into cash registers, and was really surprised to see that people buying products just paid no attention to the cost of each individual item. And so speech synthesis didn't work in that technology, and was abandoned for that application. I thought that was a good application, but it turned out not to be.
Maybe it's also because people who buy something don't want others to listen to what they buy around them.
Well, maybe that's it. I had a few thoughts. Mostly, I think people just didn't care, and if they did care, they would look at the grocery list when they got home. But most people just don't like to hear a string of numbers, and so it's just not the way people work, I guess. Anyhow, that wasn't popular, so it was abandoned after a while.
So, as you said, you follow the use of your products. I guess you also saw the episode in the Computer Chronicles where they had David Crane and showed Ghostbusters.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that must have felt pretty good to hear your speech in the game, and the game being.
Sure. I tell you, one of the highlights was that meeting Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse. There's an interesting story about the voices of Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse, that there were at one time. Well, originally it was Walt Disney's voice, but after a while, there became several people that were Mickey and Minnie, and finally Walt's son decided that there should be one voice for Mickey and one voice for Minnie, and not several voices for each one. So he listened to all the voices and had something like a contest, and selected the Mickey and the Minnie, who were two people that didn't know each other at the time, but after they got to know each other and went to several recording sessions, they got married, and they talked to each other as Mickey and Minnie. So they would come to my house for a recording session, for example. I had a recording studio in my basement, and they talked to each other like Mickey and Minnie, and it was just a real kick to be around them.
So it's a bit like nowadays when you listen to Charles Martinet, who does the voice of Mario, for example.
Yeah, right. Imagine him in your basement doing a recording and talking to you only as Mario.
Great. So you actually knew the people who were the voices.
Oh yeah. Well, I did for a long time. I did all the recordings in a studio that I built in my own basement. And after a period of time, National Semiconductor built another studio. I worked with them to build it, and started doing recordings at National Semiconductor. But the earliest things, the Commodore 64 and the Mickey and Minnie Mouse things, were recorded in my basement.
Great. And I guess the same technique is also used for all the other systems that had digital voices and samples. For example, the NES from Nintendo.
Yeah, that's correct. At that time, I mean, there was a period of time when my technology was the only speech technology. I shouldn't say only, because Texas Instrument had a competing product that was in a product they called Speak and Spell, I think. And that was a pretty good product, but video games and the coin-operated video games and the Commodore 64, those games used only my technology for a period of time, and then, as I say, the electronics technology improved to the point where there were more appropriate methods of speech synthesis.
Did you notice, I mean, did you follow it back in the day that actually Commodore redesigned the C64 in '86 and changed the sound chip and removed the bug that made it possible to play the digital samples, the speech?
I don't know what you're talking about, so I didn't apparently.
Yeah, in '86 they redesigned the C64 and they made a change in the sound chip so that speech in games would play very, very silent to a point where you almost couldn't hear it anymore.
No, I don't know anything about
you
that.
didn't know that. Okay. Yeah, that's actually the case. So Ghostbusters and so on, they only sound right on earlier models of the Commodore 64. In later models, you wouldn't hear the speech.
You're breaking up a little bit. I only heard half of that sentence.
Okay, let me repeat. I said so games that use digital samples like Ghostbusters only sounded right on the early models of the Commodore 64, not on the redesigned one from '86 onwards.
Okay, I didn't know anything about that. That's interesting. That's kind of interesting.
So let me ask you, how did you manage? Did you actually pay attention back in the day about the NTSC and PAL problems? So on NTSC it would sound faster than on PAL machines because back in the days computers were bound to the broadcast standard used in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Did you actually pay attention to that?
No, not much. It was, I think of myself as a physicist, and so I didn't get terribly involved in the business aspects or technical aspects of my technology. While it was a leading technology, I was happy to support it, but I didn't really follow the evolutions of different things in the field.
Do you know what I mean? The TV standard in Europe is different than the one
Yeah.
in America.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
machines in America would run on 60 hertz and the machine in Europe would run on 50 hertz.
That's correct. But that wouldn't affect, the clock inside a computer, inside a television, isn't synced to the 50 or 60 hertz. 50 or 60 hertz provides the power, the energy, but the clock inside might be running at the megahertz or some higher frequency. So again, I didn't really follow this, but I don't see any reason why my technology wouldn't be compatible with sort of any electronics that you put the chip in. By the way, it also ran in software initially. I wrote the software and ran it in computers or demo units that I built. And so I think many of the coin-operated video games ran my technology in software, not with a chip.
So some kind of software emulation?
That's correct.
Oh.
That's correct. Yeah. Again, it was such simple reconstruction technology that any microprocessor in a video game could do it.
Awesome. So you basically had no limits except the memory limit.
Yeah, that is correct, and again, that was true for a period of time until the memories got cheaper by a factor of 2 every 18 months, and computers got complicated, became more computational every 18 months. So it only took 2 or 3 years, maybe 5 years, before my technology became obsolete.
Did you ever think in upgrading the technology or making a the
That's an
successor?
question. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, to upgrade the technology, I would have to go to digital signal processing school and speech technology school, and I like to think I'm a physicist. And so no, that it. I decided to support this technology as long as it was viable, and it became less viable. Um, I should say that eventually my son and I started a company which he now runs, and I'm on the board of directors. So I have no technological, not very much technological input. Started a company in which they did pursue much better quality speech synthesis and got into speech recognition. But at the time that started happening, it was beyond my knowledge or desire to spend time to acquire the knowledge. So I went back to being a physicist.
You are also credited for actually pioneering in speech recognition. So are those the systems that ask you like on the phone to say something, to make a choice?
Yeah, the first speech recognition systems were. What happened was that I'm trying to be sure of my statements. These are things all happened a long time ago, and I'm forgetful, I guess. After a period of time, all of the time, I was also thinking about speech recognition, again in my simple terms, not in very sophisticated terms. But I did start a company of my own that was doing speech recognition, and that is that's the company really evolved into the company that my son is now the CEO of. And again, my simple-minded technology was good at the very beginning for the same reasons that it was simple technology to implement in a microprocessor. But again, fairly quickly, the technology of the modern technology of speech synthesis and recognition evolves sufficiently fast that for my son's company to survive, we had to bring on honest to goodness real linguists and honest to goodness real digital signal processing people, not me. And so that company's grown and is involved in both speech synthesis and recognition and a lot of products, a lot of cell phones. And for that company, I'm a member of the board, but not active in research or development.
So speech recognition works the same way as speech synthesis, but the other way around. You don't record it, but you listen to it, what somebody says, and compare it to what you think it should sound like.
Yeah. Well, the way recognition, in a simple description, the way speech recognition systems work is you set up some technology for getting key signatures out of speech, key phonemes, sounds out of speech. And then you go out and record thousands of people speaking. And so you train your recognizer based on that operates on principles that you tell it to operate on, but gets trained by listening to a very large number of voices. And so that's neural network technology. That's the so you set up a neural network that has no detailed information in it other than that it's form, and it develops the detailed information by processing a lot of phrases or words or speakers that you tell it what they're saying, and it analyzes it and picks out by the neural network, picks out key features that it thinks are important, not that you think are important. And that's the way speech recognition works these days.
And how did you get the idea to also do speech recognition?
I have to stop and think. I guess it was a kind of a natural follow-on. There was no such thing as a day I woke up and said, "Oh my gosh, we should do speech." Speech synthesis was going along well, and it occurred to me that there ought to be recognition. And we developed the technology at that time was pretty rudimentary. So the recognizer didn't really work very well, but it worked well enough that you could turn lights off and on with it for that sort of thing. And so we started the company that did that. And that's what's evolved into my son's company now, which is sophisticated and doing recognition and probably in the cell phone you own, maybe.
Oh yes, I remember there was an episode on the Computer Chronicles where somebody was like, "Oh, I can operate my computer using my voice," and it barely worked.
Yeah,
So,
well, that would be my son's technology, probably.
and that was in the early 80s, so I guess it was much more difficult than nowadays to operate your computer with your voice.
Yeah, but you know, as again, what's happened with time is that the computing technology in a cell phone is really remarkable, and so you can do very sophisticated neural network analyses in a digital signal processor that's in every cell phone. So the quality of recognition and synthesis is, you know, orders of magnitude beyond what I was doing. And that's just the evolution in time of that technology and any other.
But you were the first, so that's
Yeah,
something to
I'm
be
happy.
proud about.
Yeah, I'm proud to say that I was the first, but a lot of better people than me are doing better than I did right now.
Well, I mean, not many people can say they pioneered in something, actually.
Okay, well, thank you for saying that. You know, again, I'm getting pleasure just like I got out of the Commodore 64 from hearing that.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, mostly nowadays you use technology, but you don't know who started it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. Where did you figure out that I started speech synthesis technology? I don't know where I could go read that in the literature anywhere.
Well, I was actually googling for voice synthesis or digital samples and Ghostbusters, and then I found an article about you and your son.
Oh, okay.
And then I was looking up in Wikipedia, and I found out, okay, you are the one that invented it. And then I actually found the Atari podcast interview from last year.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So
Interesting.
those
Okay.
are the three sources of my research, and I found it by Googling.
Okay, so I can say that you're the first person that I know of who found that. So you're also a pioneer.
Thank you. Yes.
Right.
I also saw you license technology to other people,
Yes.
like to the CEO of SoftBank, who is an ISP,
Oh,
if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, that's a long story. Yes. I'm debating how much more time do you want me to talk? Because if I start talking about SoftBank, it can go on.
I have no limit. You say the limit. I don't have.
All right, I'll tell you. That's a very interesting story.
But I can say the longest interview I ever had was 4 hours and a half.
Oh, okay. I don't think I can handle that, but I can handle another 15 or 20 minutes maybe. Okay, so I was sitting in. This was in I don't know what year it was. I'm confused by years. In the maybe early 1980s. I'm not at all sure of that. I was sitting in the very same office I'm sitting in right now as I talk to you. I've had this office for 50 years at the university. And a very short, very well-dressed Chinese guy knocked on my door, and he was wearing a suit and a tie. He looked very, very formal. And he introduced himself, and he said his name was Chung Sun, S-O-N. And side note, he has changed his name, so he's now Masayoshi Sun, and he's the founder of SoftBank and so forth. But at that time, he came into my office, and he said that he had read in the Oakland Chronicle, the local newspaper, a story about my invention of a speech synthesizer and the emphasis it had on aids to the handicapped. And yeah, there was a nice spread in the Oakland Tribune on me and that technology. And so he said he saw that and he had an idea. And his idea was to make language translators so that you speak to it in or write into it in French and it pronounces the word for you in English. So you not only learn the word from the translator, but you can also learn the pronunciation of the word, which is equally important. And he wanted to go build that and as a product. Well, at that time, that was not a new idea. A lot of people were working on translators, and I knew a lot of them. The thing that made his idea new and interesting was he said that if he could make one of these things, he would set up kiosks in airports and rent them to travelers. And so he wouldn't try selling them. He would rent them out to people who come into a strange company for a few days and want to learn a few words. And I thought that was really a clever idea. The guy was clearly, as an undergraduate at Berkeley, when he came to see me, he was clearly a businessman. He knew what he was doing. And I went home that night and I told my wife I met this kid, and someday he's going to own Japan. And you know, I remember saying that and I didn't believe it, but it almost came true. I may have called him a Chinese kid. He's not Chinese. He's Korean. And so I said, well, look, I'll help you build a translator. You know, it was easy for me, and I had an engineer working with me, and he helped me. In fact, a couple engineers helped me. And we built a translator, and he said he's going to take it to Japan and license Sharp. And I thought, my goodness, he's really young and naive. He thinks he's going to get on an airplane, go to Japan for a week, and come back licensing this technology. And so he did. He got on the airplane, came back in a week, and he licensed Sharp. And he took off. And I was, for a period of time, I was sort of his technology advisor. He started a company. Oh, I have to tell you some more about him that's not related to me, but it's interesting. He started a company called M Speech Systems, which he called Mozer, which M as in Mozer. And so I was a partner in that company, and that dissolved over a period of time, but he was running the company for a while. To go back a step or two, his father had pachinko palaces in Japan. This very popular game with dropping balls. And his father had several places that had pachinko palaces. And when the first video games came out, the first one was, what's the little character that looked like an egg that walked around and chewed up things?
Centipede, maybe?
No, it was before Centipede. I knew the guy that did Centipede, but no, this was, I don't remember. It was the very first really popular video game. Excuse me. It came out in Japan before it got to the United States.
You mean Pac-Man, maybe?
Pac-Man, of course. That's what I mean. Yes. So Pac-Man was a Japanese video game, and it ran. You know, it ran through its string of popularity in Japan. Was becoming less popular.
Actually, interesting. In Japan, it was called Puckman, but they had to rename it for abroad. For obvious reason.
Well, that part I didn't know, but yeah, Poop Man. It would have been more popular, maybe. Anyhow, so his father had these coin-operated video games at a time when there was a huge demand for them in the United States and a real shortage. So Chung Sun's father was sending video games to Chung Sun, and he, with another friend of his who was a student at the university, they established what became the largest distributor of video games in Northern California, based largely on the fact that they could get them from Chung Sun's father. So that was the first fortune he made before starting SoftBank and going back to Japan. So there are a lot of other stories that I know about him, that some of which aren't even appropriate to tell you. yeah, so anyhow, that was fun. I went to Japan on several occasions with him and have seen him on rare occasions over the years. And he was and is an amazing man, obviously.
But there was some controversy about the royalties, if he ever paid you for the
No,
work you did
no,
with him.
I never got paid anything. The most I ever got paid was that he paid my expenses for on a trip to Japan. We visited Panasonic and Sharp and Sega and a lot of other companies. But he once told me that he owes me and he's going to make sure that I get paid. I never asked him for money. When he came in my office, I thought, he's a student and I'm a professor. I'm supposed to help him. So I never presented him a bill, and he's never offered me any money, and that's probably the way it'll end up. And that's okay too. If he offered me money, I would donate it to the university.
You also mentioned you worked with Nolan Bushnell in Atari, probably for the video game speech.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So how was it working with him?
Well, I didn't work that closely with him, and my impressions are not altogether good, but they're really very limited impressions. So, I met with him, no more than 4 or 5 times, and mostly it was discussing licensing technology or producing a game, and those aren't the friendliest kinds of interactions. So I don't know him well. There was a period of time when he was a pretty big figure. He is big physically. He was big figuratively in those days. He was a popular guy. But so I can't really comment.
I see. So you only did business things. But how did it feel to actually be important and go to Japan and have a business trip and then having your stuff in video games? Because as I said, it was by accident, an invention you didn't plan on, and
That's
normally
all.
you are a physicist, so you did something in a totally different field and it took off, and suddenly you are important.
Well, I'd rather think I'm important as a physicist, but I'm not sure that's even true. Well, immense amount of personal satisfaction, immense amount. Beyond that, I like to think I don't have an ego. Some of my colleagues would probably argue about that. But to me, that whole adventure, well, it was nice financially, but it was really just very much fun to do.
So you didn't really you kept being modest.
Well, yeah, you should talk to some of my friends. I think I'm modest. I think I don't think I'm on a big ego trip, but I suppose everybody thinks that of themselves. So I don't know. At any rate, my interest was never, in my own mind, was never trying to be a big shot. I was just having fun, and I was learning a lot of stuff, and people were giving me money.
Oh. Well, I'm just thinking about how it would feel to suddenly have an entry in Wikipedia and suddenly be an encyclopedia, and suddenly being a pioneer. That must really have changed your living a bit.
Well, I think the word is satisfaction. It's given me an awful lot of satisfaction. I always had a good salary as a physicist. I've never, I don't own any yachts or airplanes. The financial aspects are nice because it's putting my grandchildren through college. But really, the best single word to describe that whole adventure would be satisfaction. I got very much satisfaction from it. And I still do. I still enjoy it. I enjoy talking to people like you.
Thank you. Yes, it's. I just think it's important to keep the history and, you know, to show people how things actually happened, because people nowadays they don't think that it was hard back then and that
Sure.
somebody had to invent it.
Well, people forget very quickly. That's also true in science. So I think I've made some very nice discoveries in science, but they were made maybe 30 years ago, and many scientists weren't even born at that time, and so that kind of achievement gets lost with time, and the whatever it was that you discovered gets reinvented again by the next generation, and so it's really very important to have the history of all fields, and I appreciate what you're doing for technology. I would hope this will end up being a book or something someday.
Maybe, let's see. So
Is
far,
that-
it's
so now
being
we're discussing
YouTube
your
videos.
motivation.
Pardon, what to say?
I say now we're discussing your motivation, not mine. Is
Well,
your thought to compile all this into a book sometime?
what we do is I transcribe all, let somebody transcribe all videos, and we also publish it in our magazine. So it will be on YouTube, it will be on the magazine, and I also add subtitles to the video, so even the people who can't hear can see the video interviews.
Uh-huh.
So that's what I'm planning.
So
what I'm doing.
why
Actually.
don't you email me information on your magazine, which I know nothing about, but I probably ought to start reading.
Sure. Yes, actually, it's a disc magazine, but we also made it that way that you can even watch it in a browser, so you don't have to put it in a Commodore 64. So
Okay.
you can also
All right.
read it online.
Well, I'll be happy to do that.
Great, sure. So one thing that I noticed while interviewing people, Germans and Americans and so on, that German pioneers, German inventors, they usually at some point retire. But I noticed Americans like yourself, you keep working forever. Did you ever consider retiring, not doing anything in the university, not researching, saying, okay, this was it, I do something else with my life?
No, what I'm doing is I'm just having too much fun. It's too exciting to, there's a huge amount of satisfaction out of being the first to design some particular kind of instrument, putting it on a satellite and going out into space and making a new measurement of some kind. And that's also a source of tremendous satisfaction. And I get pleasure every day. I find it's fun to come to work. And so I'm a little bit amazed that people offer to give me money for things that I find are so much fun.
It's interesting, yeah. I see that's a total different mindset. I don't know if that has to do with culture or it's just by accident.
Uh,
For example, I interviewed Friedhelm Hillebrand, who invented the SMS back in '84, who was German, and he's not working in that field anymore, really, since he retired,
So how old is he, do you think?
He's 75 now.
Yeah, well, I went by 75 12 or 13 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good. Why stopping to do what you like?
It's exactly right. If I like something else, I would do that. I can, I can do whatever I want. But what I'm doing is a tremendous amount of fun, tremendous amount of satisfaction. And, I'm working with young students and, watching their minds open up as they, learn something. And it's hard for me to imagine something I would like to do that's better than that.
But you're doing class in physicist stuff, I guess, more in that field.
That's correct.
Do they know about your history? Do they research about you, or have they no idea who's their teacher?
No, history in one would not be far off the mark by saying that everything that you're doing was already done 30 years ago. That's an exaggeration, but there's an awful lot of research in physics. I mean, there's an awful lot of research in physics that's brand new and wins Nobel Prizes, but some reasonable fraction of what is done in physics has already been done and forgotten. And I think that's a feature of anything. It's not special to physics. I think it's true about any field, is the new generation comes along with new ideas that they think are original and happen to not be so original as they think. And so that happens.
I guess that also is similar to the retro hype that is going on in the last years. You know, like records being hip again. You know, old video games.
Yeah,
Everything
yeah,
from the 80s
yeah,
seems to come back right now.
yeah. Well, and I think that's great. I've worked with a company whose name I can no longer remember, but they were trying to write software that sounded like the software in the Commodore 64, the speech in Commodore 64 games. And so they wrote me and asked for some advice on what makes this particular sound. So, and I think that's fun. I think they're trying to emulate a little bit of history.
Did you ever um, did you ever look into other fields that are similar to yours, like text to speech, for example?
No, not really. As I say, my original interest was to understand what it is that going out in this sound wave. What is it about that sound wave that makes you understand what I'm thinking? Uh, and so text to speech would be an application, but wouldn't be sort of fundamental in the audio processes that go on in your ear and brain.
So, from this point forward, what are your plans for the next couple of years?
Excuse me while I laugh
No problem.
and cough. I just spearheaded a very, very large proposal to NASA, a very expensive proposal to NASA to build and fly a spacecraft to go out and measure some properties of the physics in the Earth's radiation belts and in space. That's a proposal that was just submitted a couple weeks ago. It's a very large amount of money. I shouldn't probably mention money here, but
You don't have to.
uh, if that is accepted by NASA, the probability of it being accepted might be 10 or 20%. It's not 50% because it's in competition with other people with ideas too. If that's accepted, that would be launched in 2022. So what I'm busy trying to stay alive till then. That would be a really exciting experiment that it's the focus of years of research are in that proposal. So you ask what I plan to do over the next couple of years. I hope it's starting to design and build instruments to fly in this mission.
Wow. As you said, staying alive, but I hope you don't really think so much about it. I mean, I think doing the research, this should keep you young and active.
You're right. You're right. And as long as you feel healthy, or at least in my case, I don't think I look like it, and maybe I sound like it, and maybe I walk like it, but I don't think I'm an old man, and I still think I have good ideas, and I'm still enjoying what I'm doing and working with very good people, including students. So I can't ask for anything better.
Mm. I was once speaking about that with Marty Cooper, who invented the mobile phone, and he is the same age as yours. And he said the major problem is that many younger people think that older people are not productive, and that's a mistake.
Well, it's half a mistake. I'm certainly not as sharp as I was 30 years ago, no doubt about that. And it certainly takes me longer to think through a problem now than I used to 20 or 30 years ago. And in fact, most of my thinking, or most of my ideas, tend to come at 4 o'clock in the morning when I lay in bed, and it didn't used to be that way. So I've certainly slowed down, and any old person slows down. But that's no reason to stop. I mean, I'm not running as fast as I used to, but I'm still moving.
That's great. I wish everybody was so motivated.
Well, the reason that I can have this attitude is that I'm in good health. So I jog every morning, and I spend an awful lot of time thinking about things, and because all of this because I'm healthy, so I don't feel like I'm aging. I probably would be very different if I had physical ailments. So I'm lucky in that regard.
Do you keep track with how things develop nowadays?
In what area? You mean in the world?
Of course. I mean, what's happening nowadays? What's going around? What's new technologies?
Well, you know, what comes to mind when you say that is the fact that there's an election on Tuesday of next week, in which the least qualified candidate in the history of the United States is the Republican candidate for president.
Donald
Yes.
Trump.
Yeah, it's Donald Trump. So, yeah, I spend a lot of time on that, and I'm mildly active in supporting various political ideas and political parties. I'm liberal politically. Yeah, so I'm very, you know, almost the first thing every morning is turn on the news and see if he said anything stupid.
Past interviews with you were mostly over the phone.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And I thought, why? Because it's such a bad quality. You can use Skype, so.
Yeah. You know, no, Skype is a remarkable invention. You know, this is a different topic again, but what is the most remarkable, what do you think is the most remarkable invention of our time?
I guess smartphones, because it combines like a computer and it adds me the possibility to talk to people all over the world. So in theory, you could talk to me over a smartphone using a front face camera.
Well, okay, so that's a pretty good answer. My answer is GPS. That's the only practical application of Einstein's general theory of relativity. And it's something you wouldn't believe, that, you know, I can know where anything in the world is with an accuracy of the order of 10 meters. That's amazing. Anyhow, that's not the topic of our meeting discussion.
Yeah, we cover a lot of topics today. Why not? You are interested in many fields, and I'm interested to know what moves you. You know.
Well, I'm certainly interested in seeing the. Okay.
So
you ought to try. You ought to try my former colleague Masayoshi Son. I don't think you can get to him, but it would be interesting to interview him if you could. He's a very, very interesting guy.
Yes, when I read articles about your relation with him, they mostly sound negative. But in this interview here, you really talk very positive about him.
Well, my view is negative only to the extent that he was a good friend when he needed me.
Okay, okay.
And it would be nice if he was a good friend when he doesn't need me. I don't need him. I mean, I don't want his money. I thought of him as a friend, and so that's the negative aspect. Everything. He's really a smart guy, and by far the best businessman I've ever met by a long ways.
Yeah, it's probably something like the media draws a picture that isn't always true. So I see the problem here. Yes.
Well, it's really true, and it was obvious the first day I met him, as I mentioned earlier. I went home, told my wife that I just met the guy that's going to own Japan.
And now he has a mobile provider in Japan, which is, I think, the biggest one or something.
Yeah, I think so, maybe. Okay, well, good luck.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.